Thanks so much, Justice, and thank you all for coming today. I'm so thrilled that you've given up your Sunday to come along and talk fungi. I mean, isn't that fantastic? Once it was for orchids or birds or something, but now you're all so fungally infected that here you are on a Sunday morning. So welcome everyone, and thank you also to the team behind this, to Janet, Helen, Heather, Justice, the whole lot of you, Alan, who's been here since the crack of dawn, getting everything set up to make this work. So thank you all so much. Well, I think today, as Helen mentioned, we've got such a lot of fantastic speakers who are going to drill down into the detail of fungi. So I thought I'd start a little bit more with a general overview of these organisms, what they are, what they do, but particularly the connections. And when Helen first suggested this conference, it was about fungal connections. I was so thrilled because so often we look at the individuality of species and the particular group that we're interested in, but we don't look at those interactions. So I was really thrilled that that became the focus. And I think back to these wonderful frameworks we have for understanding that thing out the window, whatever you want to call it. When I grew up, it was called nature, then it became biodiversity or the environment, whatever you want to call it, has always been very much premised on the particularity of species, of the individuality of species, on that biological autonomy. When you think about things like, say, our ideas that have been given from Charles Darwin, or Carl Linnaeus. I'm sure many of you know this name as well, the Swedish biologist who gave us our naming system, our what's called binomial nomenclature. We are Homo sapiens. We've got some Amanita muscaria on the table. These are wonderful frameworks. They've really given us a wonderful way to understand nature, but it's very much premised on this biological autonomy, on the individuality, rather than the interconnections between species and between kingdoms. And when I started getting interested in nature as a small child, we'd go out there and we'd pretty much make lists of things. We'd go out in spring and we'd list the orchids we'd find, or we'd go down to the coast in the intertidal region and we'd make lists of the things sticking to the rocks and in the rock pools, or we'd go out in autumn and inventory the fungi. And of course, if we're going to protect an environment, if we want to conserve this bush or this wetland or your own property, we have to know what's there. We need a baseline. We need to know what species are there. We need to know where they're distributed and how those distributions might change. But we didn't look so much at those interactions and those interconnectivities. And this is where I think fungi have really captured people's imaginations, that we actually recognise now that fungi do provide this amazing infrastructure in the soil that connect up plants, but also animals. And this time of year, we know of over 40 species of different mammals. It will be some relying very heavily, things like potoroos, wallabies, phascogales, bilbies, bettongs, antechinus, possums, relying very heavily on fungi as part of their food. So I thought I'd just start with the very basics of what fungi actually are. And some of you might have seen this little display of fungi when you came in. And I'm sure many of you realise, I'm seeing very familiar faces who've been on forays and workshops over the years, but most of you will realise when we see these mushrooms pop up, or that puffball or that jelly fungus, whatever the formal manifestation is, we're just looking at the reproductive bit of the organism. We're not looking at the whole organism, so to speak. It's just the organ of the organism. And what we're seeing here is the actual fungus organism. I'm sure you've all seen the mycelium when you've scratched around in the leaf litter or turned over a log or dug your compost. You might have seen there's cobwebby strands of hyphae that we collectively call the fungus mycelium. And this is the living, growing, feeding part of the organism that under certain conditions, typically in autumn when the soil temperature drops down, the moisture level increases, up pop the mushrooms. Everybody seen this? Amazing stuff, the mycelium. A couple of other impressions you can see here. And this one here, you can see it's just feeding on, living on this particular leaf. And some fungi have very, very particular choices for the types of habitats they live in. Some are generalists, they don't mind what type of soil or what kind of wood they live in. But some just have very, very specific conditions. Unlike plants, we know that fungi aren't photosynthesising, they don't have chlorophyll, they're getting their nutrition in a similar way to how we do, that is by the secretion of enzymes. And we do this internally, we put food into us, we secrete enzymes and we extract what we need from that. Fungi do the same thing, but they don't have a digestive tract. They pretty much put themselves into their food, i.e. the leaf litter, and slobber. They release their enzymes and absorb externally the nutrition they need. However, when fungi become even more, I guess, astonishingly arcane, is when we look at every tree out the window here, pretty much what have we got? Looks like mostly eucalyptus, but there's also a few conifers, a few Northern Hemisphere conifers and a few European broadleaf trees. We know that every single one of these trees, also every orchid, which we'll hear about in one of the talks coming up, most grasses, most shrubs, all form relationships with fungi. And what we're seeing here is the root of a tree plus the fungal hyphae, the much finer bit, you can see here, these little strands, attaching to the root system of the tree. We know these relationships as mycorrhizas. Myco, the prefix means fungus, rhiza means roots, and there's all different types of mycorrhizas. Today you'll learn about orchid mycorrhizas, also what we call ectomycorrhizas, which most woody trees form. And then there's other types of mycorrhizas we call arbuscular mycorrhizas that form a little structure inside the root cell of many crop species. Also there's other mycorrhizas that form with things like heath and heather plants. And how this works, and I know several of you have seen this little metaphor before, but please just bear with me for a moment. I always like to go rather analogue. We know what technology's like, so I always bring along my trusty vacuum cleaner pipe. It means I haven't had to vacuum the floor for about 25 years. But if this pipe here represents a plant root magnified about probably 300 times, imagine now we're all going down under the soil. So the plant root, represented by the pipe, it's under the soil, it's feeling around, it's looking for nutrients, and it's looking for water. Incidentally, who in the room studied botany in some way, either at university or at school? Yeah, okay. So were you told that plants, this conduit basically, this pipe, is getting nutrients, getting water, but what they didn't tell me is that plants actually aren't very good at it. They're not particularly good at getting enough water and getting a great range of different nutrients that they need. What the plant under the soil needs is its mycorrhizal partner to help it access more nutrients and more water, because even the finest root or rootlet is still quite a big, clumsy, clunky thing, and it can't get in between all those interstitial spaces in between the dirt and soil particles. It can't actually find its way in between them. It's too big to get in. And if it comes across a bit of buried wood, like a lectern under the soil, it can't actually extract the nutrients from within that wood very effectively. Unlike the fungal partner that has a great cache of enzymes, it can break down those recalcitrant compounds like the lignin and cellulose that give wood its hardness, but the plant itself can't do that. So I represent the fungus mycelium with this pantyhose collection. So what we've got here, if you can imagine, the fungus forms, this is the fungus, this is the plant root, we're all under the soil. It forms a mantle or a sheath around the plant root. Can I just get you to grab a toe for me? Thanks. Can you grab one, Commy? Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Justice. You're going to need to grab a toe as well. Thank you. So imagine now we're under the soil. Here's the plant root, and attached to it is this fungus mycelium. And what the mycelium does is expand out the root system of the plant and effectively increases the absorbable surface area. So the plant can now access a greater area of soil, particularly because the mycelium is much, much finer than even the finest plant root. So the mycelium can get in between all those little cracks and gaps and spaces between the particles of soil and dirt, secrete enzymes, break down those recalcitrant compounds, access water, and send them back to the plant root. Now, this is a two-way relationship. We call it a mycorrhizal symbiosis, in this case an ectomycorrhizal, ecto meaning external, myco meaning fungus, rhizal meaning root, symbiosis meaning partnership. And in return for the fungus bringing back nutrients and water to the plant gives the fungus a lovely feed of sugars that it produces through photosynthesis. So it's a two-way sharing of resources. In recent times, what we've found is that these networks of fungi might be more expansive than we realised. And the work of a British Columbian scientist called Suzanne Simard in North America, she actually radiocarbon tracked the transport of nutrients, of carbon, not just from one tree, but actually to other trees via what she referred to as the wood wide web. And the notion is that the wood wide web mirrors the World Wide Web, or in actual fact the other way around. The World Wide Web mirrors this network of interconnectivities under the soil. And what she found that perhaps it wasn't always quite so competitive as we thought, that perhaps there could be some sharing of resources among trees, and interestingly, trees possibly across different genera. So the idea is, say this tree is doing pretty well, but there's one down in the gully there that perhaps isn't photosynthesising quite so well. This tree can send that one some carbon via the wood wide web. And some of you perhaps read the book by the German forestry scientist called Peter Wohlleben, The Hidden Life of Trees. And when this came out in 2017, I think it was, it pretty much went viral. Actually went fungal, I should say. It became an instant bestseller. And what few people don't actually realise, his work was very much based on some of the findings of Suzanne Simard and this notion of the wood wide web. And it was actually a journalist from the Nature journal. Many of you will know of this prestigious journal, Nature. It's very hard to get an article in there. And Suzanne Simard's article got into it, and he coined this idea of the wood wide web. As we know with metaphors, however, they always have their limitations. They inevitably simplify things. I mean, that's the point of a metaphor after all. It's trying to make a complex, often abstract concept a bit more accessible or palatable. So Peter's book went fungal. He then went on to write a succession of other books. But what people don't also realise is that there were two scientists who were very concerned about this notion of the wood wide web and how it could possibly misrepresent what we know. Sometimes a metaphor can take off more quickly than the science. The science can't always keep up. And there were 4,500 signatories to a petition denouncing this book by scientists in Germany. So, and basically the petition was called something like, the translation was something like, even in forests, we need facts, not fairies. We need understanding, not Wohlleben, or something like this. So it was a very interesting time, because I saw, you know, as a scientist, I work with evidence, with facts, with data. We need truths, we need facts. But as a human, I really realised the importance of story. And often to convey complex scientific concepts and subjects to people, stories are a fantastic way to convey them. So I thought this is a really interesting thing. We've got this book that's taken off, and so did Suzanne Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree, and yet there were resistance to these ideas because sometimes a metaphor perhaps isn't conveying really what's going on in the forest ecosystem. So interesting time. Anyway, I just wanted to share a little story that I had. When I was doing this demonstration once for the members of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which was our first, do you know this concept of red listing? When a species is endangered, we can nominate it to go on a list, then it then theoretically gets prioritised for conservation. And the very first red list was developed by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in the 1950s in a place called Gland, Switzerland, just near the French border. And I was working with these people from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature just over the border in Vassoncy in France. And we're out in the forest, and I was using this little metaphor to talk about networks in forests and how fungi connect up to trees. And one of the members of the IUCN said, oh, actually, my day job, I actually run a crèche for little people in France. She said, can you come along and explain these ectomycorrhizal symbioses and mycelial networks to these 4- and 5-year-olds? And I went, whoa, you know, this is pretty complex stuff. And she looked at me, she said, don't be ridiculous, just bring your pipe and pantyhose, you'll be right. I thought, wow. Anyway, I'm not particularly experienced at working with little people, so I get out in the forest and all the kids are having a great time and tearing around and we're looking for mushrooms and we're turning over bits of bark and looking at mycelium. And then I get out the pantyhose, and I'd got some very special ones, you know, sort of psychedelic ones and ones with glitter and different colours, and the kids are loving it, and they're all grabbing an end of the stocking and pulling it out. So each child represents a tree connected by this wood wide web of mycelial network. As I say, I'm not particularly experienced at working with little people, and I made a fundamental flaw. I had 17 stocking ends and 18 children. So this little girl, she's tearing around, she's trying to grab an end, and she keeps missing out. The next thing, she has a complete meltdown, tantrum, spinning like a fly on her back, screaming French expletives at me. I'm like, oh no, now what do I do? Anyway, all the kids are pulling madly. There's all this tension on the wood wide web. And I said to her, okay, you've got the most important job here. I took off my hard hat and I put it on her head. Fundamental flaw number 2 was about to begin. I said to her, Your job is to decide, excuse me, which of these trees you're going to cut down because you're the forester. So we've got all these trees, each child is a tree. Not a good idea. It took her about a millisecond and she eyes off this little guy like this. And I was about to say something, but she was flying horizontally through the air. She lands on him and he goes flying, hits the ground, and because all the kids have got the tension on the stocking, they all fell down. And they understood this concept immediately. We all know that if you cut down one tree in a forest, all the trees don't fall down. I saw them all get back up and started hitting each other, so that doesn't happen. But simply the notion, this isn't a very scientific idea in many ways, the metaphor fails in many ways, but just the idea that these very, very young people are thinking not in just terms of inventorying and writing lists, as I did and still do, but in terms of interconnections, relationships, processes, and things that we don't see, that there's things going on under the soil that we don't fully understand. And therefore the notion of a precautionary principle in how we manage ecosystems, which is something that we very rarely do. The way we use fire, the way we do ecological thinning, the way we disturb soils, the way we practice agriculture, forestry. We do a lot of things with a lot of missing bits of knowledge and data and information. And I think these kids are, even though, as I say, these metaphors have their limitations, but I think about how they're growing up, walking into a forest, and instead of saying, okay, here we've got a fir and here we've got a spruce and here we've got a pine, they're thinking, oh, I wonder if that one could be connected to that one, or I wonder if this mycelial network, or even if it's not a network, even if it's what we call a saprotrophic fungus, that isn't connected to other fungi or trees necessarily, but what it's doing is putting a framework, a network, or a framework or a scaffold, I should say, in the soil. It's holding soil particles apart. As soon as we hold soil particles apart, it becomes aerated. As soon as it's aerated or aerobic, it's inhabitable. So things like those little tiny bugs and beetles and worms and slaters and things, the invertebrates, the spineless things, as they move through the soil, they aerate it further with their movements. They're actually ecosystem engineers or invertebrates in the way mammals do a similar thing through their digging. Not only does that mycelial network hold the soil particles apart, because we've now got gaps, it's like a soil sponge, water can very gently trickle down through to those deeper horizons of the soil. When we lose that mycelial architecture, whether they're the recycling saprotrophs or the mycorrhizal fungi, what happens? We lose the air, it becomes uninhabitable, we lose the invertebrates, and we revert soil back to dirt. So dirt is just the mineral components. Soil is the mineral components plus the biology. And this is what happens when we disturb soils. We have enough disturbance of soils, say through things like large-scale tilling of soils through agriculture. We actually lose the biology, we lose the structure, we lose the air, we lose the movements of water. And I remember last year when I was driving up through New South Wales when they had those really big floods, and driving along and all the paddocks on my left were all flooded, but the forest on my right wasn't. And it's simply because in the paddock, in an industrial agricultural situation where we constantly till and break up that network, we lose that mycelium, the soil just ends up becoming waterlogged and flood sits on top. Whereas in the forest, we've still got that network, that architecture intact, and the water can actually move down through the soil rather than just waterlogging or running off. So thank you very much, mycelial holders. I know it's a simplification, but as I said, to me, there's always this tension as a scientist wanting evidence, wanting data, wanting to understand. But as a person, as a human, I recognise that pretty much every culture in the world uses stories to convey science. Every Indigenous culture does it. First Nations Australian people do it, North Americans do it, South American cultures do it. That's how we often convey ideas that can be quite abstract or that we can't imagine through story. So it's interesting, I've seen over the last 25 years of running workshops around the world, I've seen this whole new, I guess, different entry points to fungi. Pretty much historically, fungi was studied through the science of mycology. A lot of that was taxonomic. It was naming of species, working out where they fitted into evolutionary history. But in many cultures, knowledge of fungi also came from subsistence foraging for fungi. So there's pretty much these two areas. There's your scientific study and then there's your foragers. And this also represented the sorts of people who'd come to workshops. We had your field naturalists, who the people back then, we didn't really have many mycologists. We still don't have a lot, though we've got some wonderful new mycologists appearing. But most of the knowledge of fungi was from our field nats, who were going out, doing forays, documenting what grew where. They were drawing them, illustrating them, sending in information. Today we're uploading them to things like iNaturalist, Atlas of Living Australia. And most of our knowledge of the distribution of fungi is actually coming from the public. And so I'd have these forayers or field naturalists come along to workshops, and the other group was pretty much always your foragers. So those who were looking for edible fungi but wanted to know which of the toxic doppelganger, the lookalike species, that they could confuse them with. In about the last 5 or 6 years, I've noticed that these two groups of people, your forayers and foragers, have expanded into people I would never have imagined were interested in fungi. And I know a couple of you know this story, but recently I had someone come along and she came into the workshop very, very serious. She came up to the specimen table and started photographing everything and making notes, and I came up to her and I said to her, "So, are you a forayer or a forager? What brings you along today?" And she looked at me and said, "Neither. I'm a crime fiction writer." I went, "Wow, okay." And she said, "And I'm looking for a mushroom that will cure a philandering husband." And so most of that workshop we talked about death caps, so that was interesting. And I thought, this was the first crime fiction writer I'd had come along. And similarly, there's another Australian author who's doing very well with her books, fiction, often crime-oriented, and she's contacted me also to know about truffle production. I thought, wow, I love it that fungi are actually becoming a theme of fiction in Australia. And then I had somebody else come into the workshop after her, and I said to her, "Oh, what brings you along today? Are you a forayer or a forager or a crime fiction writer?" And she looked at me, she said, "Neither, I'm a dancer." I said, "A dancer? At a mushroom workshop?" And she said, yes, she was absolutely enamoured with this notion of the mycelial network and these connectivities and this idea that was never really part of our concept of what nature was. It was always flora and fauna, but she was absolutely fascinated with how forests might function, and she was choreographing a new piece based on this notion of mycelium in soils. And I thought, how fabulous, move aside Swan Lake, we've got mycelial forests, this is fantastic. So we've got the crime fiction writer, and we've got the dancer, and then this other chap comes in, floats around the table, has a chat with me, and I didn't dare ask, was he a dancer, a crime fiction writer, forayer, forager? But I asked him why he came, and he looked at me and said, "Well, the mushrooms told me to come." And I said, okay. So we've known for a long, long time the connections between not just Australian native mammals and plants, but also Homo sapiens and fungi. And the use of fungi as medicines, as psychotropics, goes back thousands of years across countries. So it's an interesting time at the moment. Many of you will have been reading about the psilocybin trials and how we're changing the ratings on those, and how the significance of psilocybin and other fungi for healing, particularly things like post-traumatic stress disorder, end-of-life angst, depression. There's a very interesting time and change at the moment. So other people there as well. I had a clothing designer from Gertrude Street in Collingwood, or Fitzroy, and she was producing something called Milo, not the stuff in the green tin, M-I-L-O, but M-Y-L-O, also known as vegan leather. And she was telling me how she's basically using mycelium to produce this material that's not only stronger than leather, it's more durable, much cheaper to produce, has a much smaller footprint in terms of producing a cow takes a lot more energy than producing some mycelial leather, and also much less toxin involved in the production of it. So I had her come along, and then I had this other woman who, she was just very quietly knitting in the corner of the room, wasn't that involved in the workshop. It was a long 8-hour workshop. She was a nonagenarian, 94, had 2 stitches on the needles when she arrived. By the end of the workshop, she had the whole jumper knitted, but she seemed to be listening as well. At lunchtime, we all go out to have a sandwich, but she wasn't with us, and I was a bit concerned that maybe she wasn't able or something, so I went back into the room to see if she was all right. Well, I caught her swiping the psychedelic mushrooms off the table, so don't you worry, I can always spot you. But this is what's fascinating to me now, is that of course, the science of mycology, at last, we're finally getting some funding, wonderful new projects. But fungi are also being recognised through lots of other disciplines, and there's a new project run out of Linz in Austria called Mycelial Space, and it's predominantly been set up by academics from philosophy, art curation, sociology, who again looking at fungi more as metaphors rather than literally. There's another project run out of Oulu University in Finland, OULU. Similarly, again, they're looking at fungi not just in terms of their utility in human uses, but as ideas for how we can think about social systems differently. Rather than having these centralised hierarchical political systems, they're thinking, well, imagine if it was more decentralised like the fungi. And I sometimes think, historically, if you look in any biology textbook, it always uses the plant or the animal as the prototype for understanding nature, for understanding life. But what if that prototype was fungus mycelium rather than a plant or an animal? A whole lot of things about how we think about nature, how we think about science, how we think about life would change. Because we have these limitations. When we think about animals and plants, we have defined life expectancies. We might live to, most of us have in the Western world, I think it's 83.5 years for women. That's the average life expectancy. These eucalypts might live anywhere between 3 and 6, 7, 800 years. Things have a defined life expectancy, and yet a fungus, so long as it's got its food source under there, its leaves and sticks and organic matter, so long as no one comes along and burns them or rakes them up or blasts them away or digs up the mycelium and destroys that network, they can technically live infinitely. But there's very few places that it actually happens, that the food supply doesn't run out. So that's a very different concept to animals and plants. Also, this dichotomy of male and female gets expanded again with fungi. We don't really talk about male and female, but mating types with fungi. And many of them do have 2 mating types, but many have many, many more mating types. So again, this notion of this dichotomy of sex is challenged as well. And also even the idea of a bounded organism. If we look out there and see a parrot, we can pretty much tell we see 2 wings, we see a head, a beak, feathers. That's pretty much the whole bird. We can be pretty convinced it's a whole organism. But where does a fungus end and start? We can see the mycelium in the soil. I mean, if we're growing it in an agar plate, it's a different thing. But if it's in the soil, it's very hard to know, is this fungus organism the size of a 5-cent piece? Or is it a metre square? Or is it as big as this room? It's really, really hard to know. And often we've got multiple species, their mycelium all interacting. And so this idea of something being bounded, defined by a lifespan and defined by a dichotomy of sex limits us, I think, we're much more limited than if we had the fungal mycelium as the prototype for how we understand nature. And I sometimes wonder, would our social systems and our political systems perhaps be a little bit more fluid if we had this different prototype? I've got no idea how long we're allowed to talk for.
You've got a little bit longer.
A little bit longer? Okay. Well, I thought I'd just whip through a couple of images. Jono's got the beauty, Jono. I'm with you. So I called this curry punk and jelly brain, this talk, just because I thought it was fun. I thought that. So this is your curry punk, Piptoporus australiensis, and it's so called because it has this amazing odour, just like curry powder or fenugreek. You'd swear someone had opened a tin of curry powder if you had your eyes closed and smelled it, and it intensifies as it dries out. That's your curry punk and its friend jelly brain. And why I like presenting these sorts of fungi is that we very much think of fungi as being this umbrella-shaped cap and stalk style thing that comes up, the mushroom, that's what we're all very familiar with. But fungi manifest in all these other amazing forms as well. I'm sure you've all seen the corals out there this year. Have you seen those? Who's from around the Strathbogie, Mount Wombat area? It's just covered in corals up there at the moment. Absolutely stunning. And of course, the other symbiosis I wanted to very briefly mention, because we don't have anything on lichens today. And lichens are probably the oldest of the symbioses. And even though I mentioned before people like Peter Voleb and Suzanne Simard, we've known about these symbioses for much longer. I mean, the idea of symbiotismus, what was the term coined by, now I've lost who it was, Albert Frank, I think it was, in 1887, the German biologist. It goes back to 1887, but we knew about symbioses back in Aristotle's time. It's an old concept, but even concepts, scientific concepts, take a long time to be accepted by the scientific community and then by the general public. And it was Albert Frank, even though it's often attributed to another German scientist called Anton de Bary, but also his colleague, the Swiss scientist Simon Schwennender, who discovered, he looked under the microscope at lichens and he realised that what he thought were actually gonads in amongst the plant cells, and he recognised there's actually two organisms in here. He was wrong, they weren't gonads, but it was a fungus. There was two different organisms, an alga and a fungus with their cells intertwined. And when Schwennender put that idea out there, along with Albert Frank, guess what happened? They pretty much got denounced. I mean, what a ridiculous idea that two organisms could live together. I mean, this was that time of that Linnaean autonomy of things. You're either a plant or you're an animal. We're going to put you in one box or the other. But we know as soon as we create categories or boxes for things, particularly the fungi, they'll contravene them. The fungi got thrown down the bottom of the plant kingdom, but we realise now, of course, the fungi are a third kingdom. But this was interesting that it took 30 years for his paper to be published. And this concept is actually very, very old. And they then went on, both Simon Schwennender and Albert Frank set up biological societies and institutes in their respective countries in Germany and France. So lichens are probably the oldest of the Symbioses we know of, and we think that pretty much back Devonian or before the Devonian period, 500 plus million years ago, in that time of incredible speciation, that is a lot of evolution of the species within the oceans, we think some entrepreneurial algal cells came out of the ocean, formed a relationship with fungal cells that produced the first lichens. Some of you might know of the fossil find called Proto-Taxetes. Taxetes comes from taxus. Do you know this plant genera, taxus? The yew. And proto, the first, they thought this was the first conifer, these amazing fossil records of these first conifers. Then they realised actually they were photosynthesising in a very different way and that they could have been the first lichens, several metres tall, and they think these lichens secreted enzymes and physically actually broke apart rock to create those first primeval soils that allowed very, what we used to call primitive plants, I think we can't say that anymore, very, very ancient early plants, non-vascular plants, things like your mosses, your club mosses, your liverworts, horsetails, to actually get a root hold in those primeval soils that then kicked off that process of succession of the land. From these spore-producing non-vascular plants, we saw the evolution of grasses and then into the conifers, the vascular plants, and then the flowering trees alongside the insects. Since that discovery, we're not really sure whether Proto-Taxetes was a lichen or not, but they certainly think that the lichens were some of the first organisms on land. And this particular one, some of you might know this one, the map lichen, or Rhizopogon geographicum. I've been working quite a lot in Iceland and also on the glaciers in Switzerland. And as those glaciers recede and pull back and that bare rock is exposed underneath, pretty much the first colonisers are these lichens. And they're often referred to as extremophiles or lovers of the extremes because they can tolerate conditions that very little other life can tolerate. Huge solar radiation. Think about those rocks that we see in places like those big granite boulders, places like Wilson's Promontory or Wineglass Bay in Tasmania, and how they've got that orange coating. It's actually a lichen called Caloplaca. Imagine if we had to live on those rocks and you've got the constant splashing of salt water, you've got sand-laden abrasive winds, you've got solar radiation, you've got the guano of seabirds flying overhead, the droppings. It's a pretty tough place to live, and pretty much lichens are about the only organisms that can tolerate those conditions. And while some can survive these extreme conditions, others are what we call indicators of things like levels of sulphur dioxide in the air, and some will only grow in areas where there's very, very low levels of pollution in the air. So Symbioses, probably the first of them, were among the lichens. And even when I studied zoology and botany, because there was no mycology, back in the 80s at uni, it was often put in this way that there's some organisms, some animals or some plants have this alternative strategy called symbiosis, so they form a relationship. And I thought it was still seen as this sort of alternative way of living. But can anyone tell me anything that doesn't live in symbiosis? I don't think it's an alternative. I can't think of any organism that doesn't have some kind of interconnection with another one. So it's quite fascinating that in just a few decades, ecological concepts can change quite radically and our thinking can change quite radically. And I'm seeing that, for example, with the land care movement and very many conservation groups. And think of all the hundreds or thousands, if not millions of trees we've put in the ground in the last, 35, 40 years since Joan Kerner and Heather Hamilton came up with the land care concept. But I think today land care groups are saying, okay, we sometimes have a good success rate with our trees, but we don't always. Is there something else we can do to improve the success rate of those trees that we're planting? And they're recognising that if a tree is to survive, you've first got to have that infrastructure in the soil. You need air in the soil, you need moisture in the soil, you need nutrients in the soil, and ideally you've got some kind of fungi in the soil that are going to help those seeds germinate and help those plants grow. And so fungi are very much coming into thinking about land restoration, about revegetation of trees. Refungusing is always a little bit tricky, as I was saying earlier. How big is that mycelium? People say, can I bring this fungus and put it here and help my revegetation project? But how much of that fungus do we need? Do we need 20 cents or do we need the whole thing? It's like, if we take half of the dog, of course the dog's not going to live. You could cut an ear off and it might, but the fungus, how much do we need? And then if it's a mycorrhizal fungus on that huge gum, we've somehow got to get that into the wheelbarrow as well because it needs its partner. And then if it's a truffle fungus and it needs a potaroo to distribute the spores, we need to throw a few potaroos into the wheelbarrow as well. Really hard to transfungus compared to transplanting. But this is where thinking about how can we maximise the diversity of the organic matter instead of chipping everything or blowing it away with a leaf blow. If we keep that organic matter there, branches, limbs, sticks, leaf fragments, we attract the diversity of fungi. And if we think about those pressures and stressors, things like the digging, the tilling, compaction of soil, inappropriate use of fire, overuse of chemicals or other fertilisers, what are the things that we can actually take our fungi away? I think the thinking, it's very exciting for me to see when people are doing their re-veg projects, how do we actually encourage the fungi in these to help those trees grow? So I think in just a few short decades, we're thinking very differently about landscapes. And I think those little kids in France are already doing that from a very young age. So I'll just whiz you through a couple of more images. One of the things that's always interested me as both a scientist and a photographer is this interesting intersection between ecology, conservation and aesthetics. Because as I was saying earlier, I think even though metaphors have their limitations, they also have their place in stories because they help us access nature, even if the science doesn't have that foundation to the extent we'd like it to have. But I also think aesthetics is what draws many people to fungi. And over the years when I set up my display, it used to be very, very technical in the workshops, very, very based on these particular morpho groups and a very, very strong scientific foundation. But I realised no one was looking at the little brown mushrooms, and they were the most exciting ones. Everyone went straight to the big red ones with the dots and the green ones and the corals. And I realised how aesthetics is such a big hook for many people. Like stories bring people to science, I think the aesthetics also bring people to fungi as well. And then they venture further into the science. And a few years ago, I did a little survey, thank you, about which is the most charismatic Australian fungus. And I picked out 10 different very showy fungi. And this one, the Pixie's Parasol, got 50% of the vote. And I think there's something about blue fungi that we absolutely love. Also, another little famous Mycena, many of you will recognise this one, the ruby bonnet, one of people's favourite species. Also things like the ghost fungus, fungi that look amazing or intriguing or bizarre, but also fungi that do peculiar things, such as the ghost fungi. This one bioluminesces. It has a compound called illudin and it emits this very soft green glow, not quite as intense as this one. This is intensified with the long exposure. But also the group that's probably most well known are the wax caps or Hygrocybe, most well known in conservation circles because many of them in Europe and North America are known as grassland indicators, but they're commonly very, very colourful, very charismatic, and as I mentioned, they're indicators of unimproved grasslands. This term always makes me laugh, unimproved, because it usually means haven't been hit with fertiliser and over-irrigation. But also not just your cap and stalk style mushrooms, all these other forms or manifestations, as I mentioned before. And I think what's interesting today, I'm seeing people challenging their ideas about what fungi are, that they're not just, someone said to me before, are those orange things fungi, the corals? Not everyone recognises that these other forms are actually fungi. Things like just lost their name. Thank you, bird's nest fungi. Add the pin and club fungi as well. And the cup fungi. So I'm always interested in how can we use the aesthetics, how can we use the stories together with the science to bring people to the fungi. And of course, the earth stars that need a tiny drop of water to land on the ball. The pressure pushes the spores out through the hole there. And who would have ever thought that was a fungus? I mean, what kind of evolutionary pressures act on you to end up looking like that? I mean, I just look at this thing. You know, I watched everyone yesterday when on this foray out at Mansfield, and what I love about being out in the forest looking for fungi is that perfectly sensible adults turn into 5-year-olds. You know, it's like a treasure hunt, and you just can't get enough. It's just so wonderful. Anyway, I'll end up there. It's a very, very quick and very generalised whiz around the fungus kingdom. I'm sorry for those of you who've seen the pantyhose display before, but I still think this idea helps give an idea, this metaphor helps give an idea about networks. Have we got time for a question or two? Yes?
How do lichens spread?
How do they spread? They're very clever. They can spread in a number of ways, and oftentimes they literally just break off. There's some coral lichens on the table there, and quite often you'll notice that they're actually just separated from the ground. Very often they just break off and blow into new environments. And after things like fire, the lichens actually play an incredibly important role in colonising those burnt areas because they blow in, and often within the cells of lichens themselves, there's a theory called the body snatchers theory. Lichens actually harbour the propagules of other types of fungi, not just on the surface, but within the cells of the lichen. So it's often just through breaking off, but lichens are really, really complicated, amazing things. Being the Symbioses, as I mentioned, that's a really big question, but I might go into it. But thank you very much. Yes?
Endophytes.
Endophytes, yeah?
You probably know Alison. She's working for Chestnuts Australia.
Yeah.
And whatever. One of a PhD student isolated 11 in Liminalis on the Monaro.
Yeah.
In chestnuts, we've got a major problem with out-of-balance ecosystems within endophytes and what the linkages are to the ground and whatever else. What's your thinking? It's been a hidden part of mycology for a long time, or it's an emerging part.
Yeah, well, most early mycology was actually looking at microfungi, and particularly, mycology started in Australia with the appointment of Daniel McAlpine, who was looking specifically at rusts and smuts on cereal crops. So endophytes are the fungi or endophytic fungi, sometimes call them arbuscular fungi, that don't form that external sheath, but actually penetrate the cortical cells of the root and live within inside the cells. Things like, it's not very... And in the leaves as well, absolutely, yeah. This is getting a little bit out of my league, but I wonder when you mention with chestnuts, is this to do with the fungus being the problem, or the way where, is it a monoculture of chestnut?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah.
But, yeah.
See, I often sometimes think when a fungus gets out of control and causes the death of a crop or causes damage, it's often scapegoated as the cause of that problem, but I wonder whether we've created conditions that allow it to flourish and we've lost the other fungi that keep that one in check. And so I'm just wondering whether the focus might not be right looking at these endophytic fungi as problematic, but how can we actually grow this? Yeah, so we actually bring back those other fungi that will compete for those resources. We see this a lot commonly with things like armillaria, honey fungi, particularly in manicured systems like in botanic gardens, where the fungus is, I see it a little bit scapegoated as the cause, but because we remove all of the organic matter and we create a lot of impermeable surfaces, we lose the fungi that would have been competing for resources and possibly keeping it in check. So there might be someone who's in one of the following speakers who can answer it better than I can, but I think we might just slightly want to shift the focus back to how we plant those chestnuts, and if we could make it a polyculture.
Well, that's a major problem.
Yeah.
We're dealing with monocultures and bloody agriculture.
Yeah. The Orange Agricultural Institute, we've got the biggest collection of fungi that are seen as pathogenic or problematic in agricultural systems. And Jordan Bailey is the curator there. She'd be the one who would know more about those fungi. I'm a bit more focused on the ecto ones, but she would know about endomycorrhizal fungi. Thank you for your questions. Time for one more? Or yes, certainly.
Are there certain types of fungi that only come up every 2 years or every 5 years, or are they all annual?
No, not at all. It's a great question, and we really don't know. We're a long way behind our knowledge of botany and zoology with fungi. We're still just starting to get this sort of information, and now that people are actually doing things like sending their records to iNaturalist and the Atlas of Living Australia, this helps us answer that question. But a lot of it will depend upon the conditions. So if we have several years of drought, the mycelium might hunker down and actually not produce its mushrooms. Or if something changes in that environment, the fungi might not produce. I mean, there's certainly fungi that I don't see every year. There's some that I see very rarely, but the mycelium is probably continuously there. So, I mean, oftentimes it says in books, under favourable conditions, the fungus produces its mushrooms. And I'm not always sure about that, because you think of, say, these eucalypts, it's often under stress conditions that they flower. It'll be right in the middle of summer or drought or fire. The tree goes, I better reproduce, and out come the flowers. And I wonder whether some fungi will use that strategy. I mean, this is something, again, the mycologist might be able to answer for us, but certainly it's not an annual thing. It's based very much, I think, on conditions. And perhaps, I mean, if that fungus has got enough nutrients and it's happily there under the soil, maybe it doesn't need to produce its mushrooms at all. Maybe it's a bit of a secondary strategy to have these mushrooms. I mean, great question. Fantastic question. I'm sorry I don't have a great answer.
So I've had fungi there last year, and I've checked the same place, no soil disturbance, but they're just not coming.
Yeah, I mean, it might just be that maybe they're waiting for a particular trigger, like a drop in temperature or an increase in moisture or some other environmental variable to change to trigger them. Or perhaps the mycelium has died. Maybe some other fungus has moved in and out competed. It's hard to know, yeah, but yeah, great question. Yes?
Would you like to say a couple of words about fungi as parasites in animals?
Wow, parasites in animals? No. So, I mean, certainly we know that the cordyceps fungi, I mean, some of you might have seen, not my speciality, but some of you might have seen the wonderful series Last of Us, where this invertebrate parasite apparently jumped to Homo sapiens. But many of you know cordyceps fungi. Yeah, there's ones that actually invade the body, often of an invertebrate like a moth or a stick insect or an ant or something. And you may also have seen the clip from one of Attenborough's series where they are in the Amazon and they film all these different invertebrates infected by these fungal parasites. But it's what he says at the end of that to me is really, really fundamentally important. And while we don't like this word parasite, some of us start itching uncontrollably when we hear this parasite, what he says that without these fungal parasites in forest ecosystems, if conditions change, they can favour one species or genus that can then get out of control. And these fungal parasites are actually the regulators of invertebrate populations in forests. And this to me was astonishing because it completely turns away around this idea of parasite as problem to parasites as controlling of invertebrates. One particular ant or wasp can suddenly boom if conditions change. And I think that was even more exciting than the whole zombie end of it, the fact that they actually help us manage, or they manage for us. We're not very good at managing, but I think they are. I think I've more than used up my time. So, I haven't. Okay, great.
In the garden, does overwatering or flooding adversely affect mycelium?
Look, I imagine, like plants and animals, some have tolerances, very wide range of tolerances to changing conditions, and some fungi will be able to tolerate overwatering, but I suspect that many won't. I think like plants and animals, some will be very tolerant and some will be intolerant. So I think if that soil gets waterlogged, it could well affect or destroy the mycelium. I mean, they need air. Sorry?
But why? They don't breathe, do they?
Well, they're still aerobic. They still need to be air in soil. Yeah. So, I mean, these are all PhD. Every question here is a fantastic PhD project, to answer them. Yes?
How far underground can the mycelia actually go down?
Well, I guess it depends on, I mean, it's feeding on organic matter. Remember, it needs those sticks and leaves and other organic matter in the soil, and that's generally in the very sort of top horizon of the soil. I would guess most fungi are probably within, well, probably most within the top metre, but the majority of those are probably within the top 50, 60 centimetres, so in that organic layer. The further down you go, the more we've got mineral components and less organic matter. So, I mean, I imagine there are some that go much deeper down with the tree's roots, but I'm guessing that most are probably within that top metre. Would you see that coming? Would you say most of them?
Even 10 centimetres.
Yeah, probably.
Really the highest levels.
There you go. And this is such a 10 centimetres, and this is what we call litter, fuel. This is the stuff we blow away, the stuff we burn, and that's where most of the fungi are. So when we lose that, even 10 centimetres of organic matter, when we rake that up or blow it away and we lose those fungi, we compromise pretty much every plant in the garden. So, wow, 10 centimetres. It's a critical layer, very, very, and incredibly biodiverse. Yes?
From a biosecurity point of view, to what extent should we be concerned about fungi and so on coming in from external sources and potential impacts? And the other part of that question, of course, is to what extent are people doing something about that?
Yeah, well, that's another really big one. This is what they're focusing on at the Orange Agricultural Institute I mentioned earlier. Most fungi that have become problematic are usually the microfungi, things like the smuts and bunts and moulds and things like that. And it's usually, again, them not as a problem, but because we usually have monocultures of crops, that's when they become problematic. We have some of the tightest biosecurity in the world, and yet things still do get in. And there's a couple of macrofungi. I'm sure many of you know the fly agaric that's now naturalised with our native Nothofagus species. What are the implications of that? We don't really know. And there's another little one that I'm sure many of you know called the orange paw fungus or the orange ping pong bat, which is a saprotroph. It lives in wood. It's only been here for not even, just over a couple of decades. 2004 was first recorded in Melbourne. It's now spread throughout different ruderal environments, human disturbed environments at a rapid rate. And we don't really know, is that one, it secretes an antifungal into wood. It's quite a weak antifungal, but is it displacing our native saprotrophs? I mean, there's lots of awareness campaigns. People now are spraying their boots and things like that, which is does it have an effect? I guess it creates awareness. When I'm in the forest and everyone's spraying their boots, and then the Parks Vic, anyone work for Parks Vic? Vehicle drives past, 10 of them into the deepest forest, and I think, like it's a scale thing. But if it creates awareness that some fungi can, like plants and animals, they get displaced and then they get an advantage and become problematic. So I think at DPI, at the Orange Institute, they are keeping an eye on it, but it's really hard to know. It's really hard to know when something first comes in until we see it as a problem. It could be here for decades before it actually becomes problematic. But I don't think I've been anywhere in the world where biosecurity is as tight as coming into Australia. So, other than New Zealand, actually, yeah. Anyway, one more question, yes?
More a comment, really. You're telling the story about mycelium, and I find it absolutely fascinating, and I just get this sense of what you've done with your stories and your conversation there, because the words of have gone out like mycelium into these little receptors, and we're all busily working away and connecting with it, and I just want to say that.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think that, again, another nice metaphor that I think we're all spreading the mycelial tentacles or fibres of fungi. But it's always important to keep the science there with the metaphor. But I just love it that fungi now, we're losing that mycophobia, the fear of them, and we're coming to fungi from all these different perspectives. So it's a very interesting and exciting time in Australia. But it was a very fast whiz around the kingdom, but thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the other speakers who'll drill down into more detail about fungi. So thank you so much, everyone.